Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Blair Witch. I think the thing this film does is it gives the Blair Witch the sequel that everyone presumably wanted. It actually makes a found footage follow-up sequel, which everyone kind of wanted a lot more than a non-found footage follow-up sequel, which was a mistake, but it being kind of the first Hollywood found footage film. Obviously Cannibal Holocaust was before and really kind of invented the genre and very much influenced the Blair Witch itself. They didn't really know what to do, and they made a major misstep, something that the Paranormal Activity films would basically take advantage of by doing a proper sequel. Now, this isn't unique to the Blair Witch movies. In fact, there are other times where there's one film that kind of strikes the mold, and then another film gets to be the franchise, and that is you compare Halloween and Friday the 13th. Halloween is probably one of the greatest horror films ever made. It changed horror filmmaking, some say for the better, some say for the worse, but whatever, it changed it, and it never was really the successful franchise, certainly in terms of quality, but Friday the 13th became the successful franchise. I don't think any of the Friday the 13th movies are as good as the original Halloween, but I think a lot of the Friday the 13th movies are better than the Halloween sequels. Blair Witch is similar in that vein. I don't think any of the Paranormal Activity films are as good as the original Blair Witch, but I think the sequels, or at least this sequel, seems to owe too much to the original, and they waited too long, but it also wasn't built for a sequel. Jaws and Speed are two examples I always use as films that are kind of one and dones. They work as one film, and then you get ridiculous sequels. You either get the hilarious Jaws the Revenge, or Jaws in 3D, or Speed on a cruise boat or something. They're films that most people just imagine as the first film. And I think this sequel proves that Blair Witch was not, much like Halloween, really made theoretically to have sequels to it. And it's kind of the thing that everyone always dreaded when the original one came out, is that anytime that there's a great little indie film that makes tons of money and audiences love it, and well, not so much with the Blair Witch Project, that part, but it spawns all these cheap to make sequels. And the Blair Witch Project never fell into that as much. It had one and people hated it and they went, well, that didn't work, whatever. And suddenly there's this one, and it's surprising considering it was such a successful independent film that there weren't more sequels. I mean, it is a little surprising. And in some ways you could say the pedigree with this film as kind of the promise that you always hope for a return to a horror franchise, where you get an actually really good promising director, not just, some guy who will just actually do it to make one. That would be Adam Wingard and the guy who's written The Guest and You're Next, and a lot of his stuff, Simon Barrett, working on Blair Witch, and you'd think that would be really great, but instead it falls under owing too much to the original. It is incredibly predictable, it is incredibly boring, and it reminds me, I think I kind of like The Guest much more than their horror stuff, and this kind of falls into a lot of things that you can tell they're more experienced Hollywood filmmakers making this on a technical level. You can tell it's not just, some crappy college students who made an independent film at this point, but you almost expect them to know better, and it feels like Hollywood is trying to stumble on that jar of lightning that they caught in the original film and just failing at doing so under the kind of typical Hollywood multiplex predictable horror nonsense that you probably really didn't want from a Blair Witch film, but we probably should have expected from a Blair Witch sequel, especially at this point, and wish we weren't expecting it because this director is frankly a lot better than that. James Donahue, who is the brother of Heather Donahue, who is 4 years old, apparently, when she died, doing the typical horror movie thing where go, well, what if the half-uncle once removed wants to find them? Which I feel like if I disappeared, like, my mom would care, but I don't think any other relatives would get that involved, but whatever. But he has found a video that has been uploaded on YouTube, video that has a DV tape showing the Blair Witch that might be his sister, sort of, and then he gets his friend, who's a girl, who is a lot like Heather, who he has a crush on, Freudian, that goes along with him and is documenting this, and then they bring her along, their two friends, and they go to contact this YouTube person who lives near Burkittsville, Maryland, and they all go into the woods to find where they found the DV tape and possibly find Heather because they feel like she might be in the woods, or find out maybe some more signs of what actually happened to her. And they don't mention the other two people, but sure, if we found those two, that would be cool. And then they venture into the woods and the Blair Witch starts messing with them, much like what happened in the original Blair Witch Project, and they hope maybe they will find Heather, or at least make it out alive before the Blair Witch comes and takes them all. The thing with this movie is it was predictable, and I think that's the thing that hurts it the most, and that's the thing most audiences will remember it for, is that unlike the original Blair Witch, you can complain nothing happened and you didn't see anything. And it's kind of a film, a horror movie that's more for cinephiles and film critics than audiences in a lot of ways. And that's why its memory has lived on a lot better with people who care about older films, but most average people look at it as kind of a disposable hype thing. This film explains a lot more, and explains it in more exhaustive detail. It's a lot less work in terms of explaining the mythology. There were documentaries and all sorts of cool little things with the original Blair Witch Project that I got into, that you could buy a book and you can learn about the legends and this deep mythology that you could get into. And in this film, they explain it all, so you don't need to do that. And that wasn't essential to understanding the Blair Witch Project. It was just kind of things they would reference, and as much as you needed to know in the Blair Witch Project, they put in there, but there were extra little other things you could get into, but it would just make you more interested in the movie, certainly, but it wouldn't affect the film. This film takes all of that and uses that, and although that is an interesting idea, and there's a lot of interesting ideas within this, and it has interesting directors, it fails so hard, it got boring after a while. And I'm someone who really likes the Blair Witch Project, but in this movie, it's kind of trying to appeal to the average audience, but it's doing it in kind of the Force Awakens kind of way. Like, let's take the framework of the original that people presumably like, and let's make the film around that. And that's kind of boring in a lot of ways. It's not inventive, they don't do anything interesting with it, and it's doing a lot of beats that horror films have done with it before, and it makes it so predictable. I mean, the interesting thing about Force Awakens is it kind of goes on its own tangents, as well as doing A New Hope or Episode 4, whatever you want to call it, or the original. And like, what this is doing is it's taking the framework of the original Blair Witch Project, kind of the similar plot, a lot of camera angles, like I'm so scared type of things feel echoed throughout it, but what it's doing is doing a predictable horror sequel on top of that. So the lack of anything interesting, I think Adam Wingard takes a lot of things and remixes them and makes, like, The Guest feels like a John Carpenter movie, it feels like My Bodyguard, it feels like a lot of things, but he does something really like interesting and crowd pleasing with that. And with Blair Witch, he does everything predictable and Hollywood with that, and it gets to a point where I'm just like, what am I even watching with this? It doesn't feel interesting, it doesn't feel fun, it felt really boring. In fact, I had to go to the bathroom at one point. There's sometimes when I go to the bathroom during the movie and I feel kind of bad for missing part, especially because I'm doing a review. I feel like, am I doing this some injustice? How dare I have to pee? But at this point I felt, well, it doesn't matter, because I feel like when I get back I'll be able to fill in the blanks, and yeah, it didn't affect my viewing of it at all. I got more and more bored, and I actually had one of those seats. It was like a recliner seat that you could move, and no one was in the theater, so I had a lot of fun moving that around. It kept me in the movie a little more, so that was cool. It felt kind of what I remember about Your Next, that it felt so basic genre, it didn't feel interesting enough, and I think I was never a huge fan of Your Next. I found it fine, but with Blair Witch, it felt almost like The Visit, where you had some filmmakers who knew what they were doing in The Visit, like M. Night Shyamalan, making a found footage film. And although that's interesting, I've yet to find that be as interesting as a bunch of less experienced filmmakers doing it. And I think there's a certain amount of experience that doesn't work for that. It's like listening to Metallica's Saint Anger. Like, you can't really go back again and do that. And maybe you could, and maybe someone could, but I have yet to find a good example of someone really doing that. It's kind of more of an interesting idea, an interesting theory than it's ever carried out. And I think Blair Witch is another example of that, but it just reminds me of the think pieces in '99 saying, you watch, this is going to create a lot of crappy Hollywood sequel versions of this. And in a lot of ways, I think the Blair Witch was robbed of its true crappy Hollywood sequel that was more like the original. And we've finally done that. But what has this accomplished? And I think that's kind of the thing that doesn't work with it, is it's experimental, which this film doesn't really get into the original. The original did a lot of things that a horror movie hadn't done before, and it was made by kind of outside horror people. And getting horror people to make their own Blair Witch, I honestly think conceptually, I don't blame the studio. I don't really know what happened behind the scenes. But basically, like, the ideas coming together for this felt like an actual decent idea. Getting horror people to do a Blair Witch, doing things that this franchise hadn't done, and understanding they had a property that they could continue and make a franchise of. And I think with Blair Witch, they probably thought, hey, maybe this will work this time if we do it this way. Somehow it didn't work because of that, because I think they were just edging too close to making a genre film. They didn't make anything else, but this is far more boring than Your Next. I think it's the worst film I've seen from Adam Wingard so far, and he's one of my favorite favorite and what I feel is the most promising directors right now, but I'm starting to not appreciate that promise as much because I think Blair Witch just is kind of such a basic horror film. I like how it plays with things. I like when it gets in more of the funhouse-ness of it. Feels too much like the 2016 kind of reboot kind of a thing, just using the structure of the original, doing the sequel that everyone wants them to do. But in a way, what I'm getting from this now is Halloween 4. Nobody really likes Halloween 4. Halloween 4 sucks. I mean, it's an awful movie. The Halloween franchise is a complete failure. And when I look at Halloween 2, I don't like it as much really, and Halloween 3 was obviously trying to do something different. I'm not going to get into that. But I think Blair Witch reminds me of that, thinking like, well, this is the film people think they want. But in a way, they're not thinking about what is the right film theoretically. And I think the problem with the Blair Witch is theoretically, they went into the woods, their footage was never found, that's the end of it. And theoretically, there isn't, I don't think, a real way to make a sequel to the Blair Witch that will work, or at least they haven't found that way yet. Doing kind of the normal kind of horror thing that we've seen done a million times is not the answer to that, because what the Blair Witch did was something different and unique. I think that's what was so amazing and interesting about the Blair Witch Project. This film doesn't do that. This shows you why the Blair Witch Project could never happen at a Hollywood studio. And Lionsgate tried to say differently. They failed because you can't catch lightning in a bottle the way you did with an independent film on a Hollywood level, or at least you couldn't with these guys. Maybe one day someone could make a successful sequel to the Blair Witch Project, but I think it's kind of a fool's errand in itself, and they're kind of just proving everyone right that Hollywood will always buy up a successful independent film, and it's a huge hit, and they'll make a bunch of shitty sequels, and all this is doing is affirming everyone right and doing very little else than that. It's not an entertaining movie. I didn't like the people in it. All the drone stuff was stupid and just felt very predictably 2016 in the most boring way. And there's a lot of stuff they bring in and don't use. The drone stuff was, I don't understand why that was there. They do a lot of really dumb horror things. There's certain times you're like, why did they go into the house? Like at the end of the Blair Witch Project, and I'd always say, well, it wouldn't be very scary if they didn't go into the house. But then when you have someone climbing a tree when a witch is chasing them, you start to lose that even slight believability or going with the movie because it's a horror movie and, you know, giving it a break basically. Blair Witch doesn't give you that kind of confidence in it, and it shouldn't, because it's not a very good movie. It's kind of just a predictable, boring, multiplex horror movie, and that's all it really is, and it'll probably be forgotten because of that, because it's just frankly not very good. I wasn't really scared by it, and then I just started playing with my recliner seat because that was a lot more entertaining than this movie was, because it was just so fucking predictable. A bathroom break was hardly noticeable because I felt like I could fill in the dots myself during the time I was away from it, and that doesn't speak very highly of its storytelling capability, and it doesn't speak very highly of being able to follow up one of the more iconic and successful independent films of all time. It just shows you how Hollywood churns up ideas and spits them out predictably. So I guess kudos to that. You've just shown us everything we already knew all over again with a franchise that probably should have never been. So if you have seen Blair Witch and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. If you're watching this wondering, why am I wearing a suit? Where am I? I'm actually in Chicago right now. I'm here for a wedding. My wife's a bridesmaid, and since she had to go earlier and I had an afternoon to myself, I decided to see the Blair Witch in Chicago at the lovely Regal Webster Place, and I just thought it'd be a cool thing. I like seeing movies in other states, and this is like the only one I really wanted to see that worked out time-wise. So I'm in Chicago, and that's why this was late. There will be a Chicago trip video. I wanted to say one thing. There is a Chicagoan that I should have been able to see, and I didn't get to see him, mainly because of my own fault, to be honest. I should have messaged him before, and that was Sinram, who's been a real big supporter of this channel and a really cool guy to me for a very long time, and I should have worked that out, and that's really my fault, and it would have been cool to have him in my trip video and just see him in general. Either way, you should check out Sinram's channel. He's on the side of my channel all the time, so if you want to subscribe to him now or later, but you should check it out. He makes a lot of really good videos, and he's an awesome guy. It didn't work out scheduling wise, and Sunday, just, I don't know, wedding stuff, and I kind of like just shooting different videos in different locations sometimes, if I can. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but this time it did, so I'm shooting a review in Chicago in this Airbnb where I am, which was apparently a hotel for mobsters. So I hope there's no ghost prostitutes in this video, but maybe that'd be cool for a Blair Witch review. I hope there's not. If you saw any ghost prostitutes, let me know and screen grab it or something. But anyway, that's why everything's different, and I wanted to get dressed for the wedding and get all ready and then shoot the video. Also, the reason the audio is different is I did not bring my mic because I did not realize I would be shooting a review here, and so it just happened, so that's why it sounds a little different. But thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the Chicago trip video when it goes up. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.